library for our program tonight. We are very happy to have Mr. Gardner here to do his little spiel for us. He's going to be building a wall and all kinds of information about why we have the walls around here, how we got them, and how you can maintain yours. If you don't have one, he's going to build you one and show you how it's done, so you can just go home and build your own. I did want to say that we do have a program coming up next month. If you are interested in the whole back to the land, back to your roots, we do have a gentleman coming who is a poultry expert from the Topsfield Fair, Ed White, and he will be giving a talk about raising backyard chickens next October 23rd at 7. And you're welcome to come back to that if you're interested in why you might be wanting to raise your own chickens, or how hard is it. He has the answers for you. But right now I want to introduce Mr. Gardner. Kevin Gardner is the author of a book, The Granite Kiss. He did bring copies here if you're interested. He's also an expert. He's been a stone wall builder for over 40 years. And he is going to talk about, like I said, how we have them, why we have them, and how to maintain them.
Thank you, Amy. Well, I want to add my thanks to all of you for giving up a perfectly good evening to listen to a total stranger talk about rocks, and also to Amy in the library, of course, for inviting me. I'm going to talk to you a little bit, as Amy said, about the history of our New England stone walls, about how they are put together, about how their styles developed and changed over time. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about some of these other books I brought, because as sad as it is to say, I am not the only person who ever wrote a book about New England stone walls. But I also want to begin with a bit of a disclaimer, and that is this. If you can't see what I'm doing on this tabletop while I'm talking to you, please don't give it a second thought. It has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm just trying to keep my hands busy. But I want to begin by talking about a particular year, a very important year in the history of our network of New England stone walls. And that year was 1871. In 1871, our enterprising federal government decided that it would be a swell idea to measure all the fencing in the United States. They delegated this critical task to the Department of Agriculture, which took about a year to do it, and then released a voluminous report full of many facts. One of them was this: that in the 6 New England states and the state of New York combined, in other words, the northeast corner of the United States, there were more than 250,000 miles of stone wall. 250,000 miles. That is more mileage than there is railroad track in this country at the present time. It is longer than the entire length of the U.S. coastline. It is enough stone wall to go all the way around the world 10 times. Wow. It's enough. This is the last one. It's enough to stretch from the parking lot of this library in a straight line to the surface of the moon. Why we do not get more credit for this incredible communal architectural accomplishment is a mystery that may never be solved. There are 2 wonderful facts about this number. First of all, it's wrong. It's too low. And it's too low because the report that contains it was only written about fencing. And as anybody who lives in New England knows, there are a great many more kinds of things that are built out of dry-laid stone, that is to say, stonework that is not held together by any adhesive, mortar, or anything else, only its own weight and the skill of the builder. These other objects that are not fences built out of dry-laid stone include things like stone-lined wells causeways, bridges, and of course thousands and thousands of foundations under houses and barns. None of these was included in the report. Because the stone wall and other structure network here in New England was so extensive, it's been calculated by the anthropologist Edwin Ray Teal from Connecticut, who apparently did not have enough to occupy himself, that more stone has been moved by hand and animal power here in New England and put in different places and in different structures than has been moved in the entire rest of the world combined. This is not my assertion, but his. Just the fact, however, that this assertion can even be made gives you some idea of the almost incredible amount of work that must have gone into rearranging the landscape here in New England in order to make use of all that stone. The second wonderful fact about this number has nothing to do with the number itself, but rather with the year in which the survey was taken. Because 1871 turns out to be an extremely important, well, you might say a symbolic kind of year. Because if you had to pick a year in which we began to lose more stone walls than we were gaining, a year whose actual identity no one really knows, you could do a lot worse than pick 1871. And that is because by the three-quarter mark or so of the 19th century, the incredible changes in the way that agriculture was pursued here in New England had settled in to such an extent that there is no question that by then we certainly were beginning to lose more of the old stone walls than new ones were being built. I'll just give you one example of how this occurred. Imagine, for instance, that you were mowing hay in a nice, tidy little 3-acre field. And it's important to understand that when European-style farmers first appeared here in New England, early part of the 17th century, the model that they used in order to lay the land out for farming was essentially a medieval model. It held that small fields produced best. This was because all work was done by hand. And so here you are in your little field, and you are mowing hay. The field is perhaps 2.5 or 3 acres, and it's bounded by nice, tidy little stone walls. Well, if you're mowing with a scythe by hand, you can literally step right up to the edges of those walls, can't you? Into the corners and cut almost every blade of grass in the place. But by 1871, many farmers were no longer mowing their fields by hand with the scythe, but were rather pulling a 10-foot cutter bar behind a team of horses. When you are pulling a cutter bar, you have to start turning out 20 feet before every corner. That means that in every single field you have, there are now 4 useless triangles of land. Useless triangles of land are not very popular among frugal New England farmers. And so, by the latter part of the 19th century, a great many of them who still lived on farms that were viable, as many, especially in upland areas of New England, were not by then, found themselves digging large trenches beside stone walls that in many cases had been built by their own fathers or grandfathers, dumping the stone walls into them and burying them just below the surface of the ground in order to enlarge their fields and make them more conducive to productivity in the machine age of farming that had just begun. So that's only one example of how it was that the great tipping point was reached in terms of production of stone walls here in New England. This accompanied not just the idea of machine farming, but it also included a great many other changes that had come to pass over the course of the 19th century, not least of which was the wholesale abandonment of an enormous number of small farms, especially in upland areas. The Civil War had something to do with it. Many farmers, of course, went off to war and did not return. Many other farmers who went off to war and did return learned that there are places in this country where the topsoil is 6 feet deep, not 6 inches deep, and so managed to come home just long enough to throw all their tools into a wagon and head off for Ohio or Missouri or the upper Midwest, someplace where farming did not resemble an act of desperation or insanity. This resulted in the abandonment of thousands and thousands of small farms, particularly in the hill country. And as that occurred, reforestation set in many of those areas and began to hide or otherwise obscure all the stonework that had been done in these places. We then entered a kind of spell of malaise, you might say, here in this part of the country. A malaise that was not broken until the middle of the Great Depression at some point, and therefore lasted in the neighborhood of 40, 50, 60 years. It became something of a cause at one point. What's wrong with New England? Began to be perceived as a place of degeneracy, of no interest, of cultural and economic decline, and so on and so forth. There were magazine articles about it. States tried to take steps to repopulate their farming territories. The invention in my state of New Hampshire of Old Home Day, a kind of celebration that was meant to bring young people back into the state, failed completely of its purpose, but was so enjoyable by those who did remain that they have kept it, and it is still in existence, even though its actual purpose was never fulfilled. The prevailing theory among college professors and other sociologists is that the Depression was good for New England. My own parents, who lived through the Depression in New England, would take a different view of that. However, the Depression did do one big favor for New England. It dragged the rest of the country down into the trough where New England had been living for 40 or 50 years, thus evening the playing field and making it possible for us to bounce back. And it truly is extraordinary how many things that we now regard as economically or culturally very much of New England, including things like the ski industry and the tourist industry in general, the summer theater industry, and many symbolic things as well. For instance, Yankee Magazine, that great voice of New England virtues, published its first issue in 1935. The seminal American play Our Town by Thornton Wilder made its Broadway debut in 1938. Things like that. Well, why am I talking about all this in a lecture ostensibly devoted to stone walls? Because that long economic and cultural malaise that New England entered in the latter part of the 19th century, that lasted well into the 20th, tended to slow or halt new development in many parts of the region, especially in outlying areas and in the hill towns. You know, there are towns in my own state, and I know out in western Massachusetts as well, that have not yet managed to return to the populations that they had in 1830, which we can take as the peak of the small-scale farming lifestyle that produced all these stone walls that we still have. The Depression and the malaise that came before it, however, acted as a kind of preservative for a great many of the features of the older New England landscape, including, very much so, its old stone walls. Because there was such a long period of not very much economic activity, very little new physical development in the landscape, it gave those old walls a chance to, after they disappeared into the growing reforested areas, simply stay in place. Since nothing came along to take their place or to precipitate them being removed, we still have enormous amounts of the old network with us. And that is what is significant about the very slow, lingering depression that descended on New England in the latter part of the 19th century. Well, how did we get all these stone walls anyway? It seems as though, when you see how ubiquitous they are, they must have been built up over many generations, painstakingly, bit by bit, over every piece of landscape. But in historical terms, we acquired them quite quickly. One estimate holds that the bulk of New England's network of stone walls was erected in about a 50-year period, from about 1775 to perhaps 1825. That doesn't mean that no stone walls were built before those dates or not after, only that this identifies a period of peak building, which has actually been identified as a kind of frenzy of stone wall building that accompanied the prosperity of small-scale agriculture in the aftermath of the American Revolution, as things began to settle down and the population began to be able to concentrate on making a living rather than fighting the British. And so, for northern New England, the part that I come from, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, that timeline for peak production of stone walls is even shorter. It runs from about 1800 to about 1830 or so. It's a minute historical amount of time for such an incredibly profound mark on the landscape. The beginning of stone walls, however, in any given area was not something that occurred right away when settlers would arrive. The exigencies of having to make a living, create shelter, find basic necessities of life such as water, clear enough landscape to have fields to plow and plant and to pasture animals in, to cut hay and so forth. Those things took priority in any given area when settlement was brand new. The first choice of fencing of these settlers was not stone. It was organics. It was split rails, disorganized piles, running piles of brush, pulled stumps set up in long disheveled rows and so forth and so on. In other words, the mess that results when you clear away a whole lot of forest. At the same time, and no New Englander needs to be told this, we live in a remarkably stony part of the country, and so part of the task of clearing any given area for farming activity was, of course, the removal of enormous amounts of surface stone from the landscape. This, too, did not occur immediately in any given area as settlement first arrived, because Native American agriculture had cleared off many spaces that were perfectly good for planting corn and squash and the early crops that sustained European settlers. And in many places, especially when you got nearer to the coast, there were lots and lots of areas that had been abandoned by Native American farmers following the onset of the terrible diseases that wiped out most of the coastal tribes during the first contact years of the latter 16th century and the early part of the 17th. And so there was quite a lot of cleared farmland that wasn't occupied when settlers first arrived. This was true for the Massachusetts Bay colonists and the Plymouth people. And it was true for others who followed the rivers and came into areas that had been used by Native Americans for their own brand of much less intensive agriculture. However, as the 17th century moved on and great population surges began to arrive in this country, mostly from Great Britain, farmers found themselves moving into areas that had not previously been subject to any agricultural activity at all. And this is when they began to encounter the famous stony fields of New England and to clear them off. Their first choices were to simply take the stone to the edges of their fields where organic fencing already existed and throw it up against those old walls of split rails and brush and so forth. Then they discovered, as time went on in any given area, that the forest was not the unlimited resource they may have thought or imagined it to be. And so they began to find themselves less and less able to devote organic materials to fencing. Realizing that the answer was right there on the fence lines themselves, the beginning of stone walls in New England came as a kind of reorganization of supplies of stone that had already been collected along the fields and roadways of the area towns where development had proceeded enough so that farmers could begin to devote some time to what you might think of as the agricultural infrastructure of the entire region. This is when stone wall building began to take on a certain amount of urgency. It was very much accelerated by an event that occurred in the early part of the 19th century, however. This was the importation of the first merino sheep into this country out of Spain and Portugal. As soon as the merino hit New England, it became an enormous success and began to make a lot of farmers rich. This event occurred in 1810. After that, the acceleration of stone wall building literally went bonkers. It became a near obsession of many farmers to enclose as much land as possible because sheep, of course, have to be contained in a way that the earlier treatment of livestock did not demand quite so much. And so this is when we begin to see stone walls appear virtually everywhere, including in places where human beings can barely stand, and I'm talking about the steep hills, the way they seem to dive up and down mountainsides, to run into brooks and come out the other side, to create impossible geometry in the in the woods and the old abandoned fields, and literally to exist almost everywhere. At the same time, they still found themselves unable to use up all the stone that was available to them, and so we began to acquire enormous storage dumps out in the woods as well. In some cases, dumps that were intended for later use. In other cases, simply an excess of stone in terms of what the farmers in any given year, what their needs were. And so it simply was left to store until a project would appear for it, or until such time as it could be moved to another place. This enormous network of walls was largely complete by about 1840 or 1850. After that, the economic situation in terms of the sheep industry, the onset of the Civil War, the slowdown in economic activity due to the coming of the railroads, which created competition for New England products in ways that was not favorable to many of the sub-industries of New England farming, and also the outmigration that began to occur, not just because of the Civil War, but also because of the Industrial Revolution, which created factory work in places like Manchester and Lowell and Lawrence, and began to draw young people off the farms. The playing out of so many thousands of acres in the hill country, mostly due to terrible farming practices by those who were farming in the mid-19th century, and also the stripping of the forest from those hillsides, which precipitated a cycle of erosion, which actually left New England quite a bit stonier than it had been before these settlers arrived. All of these things conspired to put an end to widespread stone wall building by the middle to the three-quarter mark or so of the 19th century. Barbed wire also played a part. It came along in 1868, just before the report was made by the Department of Agriculture. This occurred at exactly the same time the sheep industry was permanently playing itself out, and the primary animal for raising on New England farms became the cow, which is easily contained by barbed wire in a way that sheep are not. So there was a kind of conspiracy of events that put an end to widespread stone wall building in the middle to the three-quarter mark of the 19th century. Well, how are these walls all put together? There is, for you Star Trek fans, a prime directive in stone wall building. It is this. If you are going to put together a structure of dry laid stone, you must be sure, I'm sure some of you have heard this, to place one stone over two. This is my sole physical demonstration. Or two over one. Or, in other words, to break the joints between individual stones with the layer above and the layer below, in order to create multiple physical dependencies for every stone in the wall. This is the opposite of placing stones directly on top of one another. This is called stack bonding. And it's a terrible mistake because it segregates the wall into structurally separate sections, which can then come apart much more easily. When the stones are supported not just by two others in most cases, but by 3 or 5 or 9, and then cross-hatched that way, not just in the outer face of the wall, the part that you can see, but also within the wall too, in its interior, then each stone has a much better chance of remaining in its assigned position for a little bit longer than it would otherwise. There is a myth about, well, there are several myths about stone walls, or about stone walls in general. One of them is that they last forever as first constructed. This is completely false. All stone walls eventually fall down. The trick of building correctly is only to make them last as long as they possibly can. Why do they fall down? After all, they are stones. They don't have legs. They're not going to go anywhere. But the truth is that every stone in the world has an ambition. A personal ambition to sink to the center of the earth as soon as possible. It is extraordinarily patient about obeying the dictates of this ambition. Now, if nothing ever happened in the woods or fields or places where these walls exist, then they might have a reasonable chance of sticking around for several hundred years instead of the 75 to 80 years or so that they're capable of standing around now. But the fact is that we have earthquakes here in New England. Why, 2.5 years ago or so, we had a massive 4.0 monster over on the Maine border that rippled right across New Hampshire. Every once in a while, and it's fairly common too, we have little tiny 1.6s and 2.3s, earthquakes so mild that human beings can't even feel them. The stone walls do. Every time one of those ripples across the landscape, every stone and every wall goes, hey, here's my chance. My chance is to get a little closer to the center of the earth. And if there's any space around that stone within the structure that it occupies, it will slip or slide with that stimulus into that space in order to get a little closer to the center of the earth. When that happens, the relationships, whatever they are, that it has with other stones in the wall in terms of structure, what it is holding together, what it is helping anchor, all change. And that is why stone walls are like people. They tend to spread out as they get a little older. And that is why they tend to fall down as time goes by. And it's not just about earthquakes either. Changes in the way that water is moving under the wall, the growth of tree roots by trees that are too close to the wall. This, of course, occurs many, many times in reforested areas. The tunneling of animals that tunnel underneath them, and the clambering of animals or humans, for one reason or another, over the tops of them, knock stones off the top. There are all kinds of things that occur. The occasional frost heave that throws walls out of alignment, changes in the rate of compression from one part of the wall into the ground that it's sitting on, that's uneven in terms of how it's compressing barely 2 or 3 feet away on the same line of wall. All those things have something to do with the gradual deterioration of stone walls. In fact, the stone walls of New England, as a general rule, are in relatively terrible shape compared to the way that they looked when they were first built. That's why I was so fascinated by the tall ones you just told me about down in Deerfield, which is near Deering, which is near where I live, because the standard heights of farmer-built or other other traditional stone walls from the early days was in the 4 to 5 foot range, not the 2 or 3 feet that we see now. In fact, there were laws in the state of Connecticut mandating that any fence, stone or otherwise, that was meant to contain livestock had to reach a height of at least 4 feet. This was particularly true for the sheep industry. It was another way in which the sheep craze had a great deal to do with the way New England looks today. Because sheep are the ultimate grass is always greener animals. If they can see beyond the confines of whatever field they are put in, they will want to go there. If they cannot see into that area, then it doesn't exist. And that is why the old stone walls, especially those built during the days of sheep raising, were much, much taller than what we see nowadays. Now, we've become used to the low, tumbling look of our New England stone walls. And that also reminds us that the way this landscape looked during the heyday of New England's era of small-scale family-type farming was profoundly different from what we see now. There's a story about the men in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, which is a little town in the southwest corner of New Hampshire, about 80 miles from Boston. About the men who were building that town's meeting house one day in 1776, who were able to hear and see the cannon fire and the smoke from the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, 80 miles away. Because the landscape that they were looking across from the hilltop on in Jaffrey, where they were building their meeting house, was wide open. There were no large tracts of unbroken forest at that time. If you stood on a hill in any town, you could see for many, many miles, right across whatever valley that you were facing, to different towns, different states. There was an openness to the landscape that is reminiscent of the way Great Britain looks today in many places, especially in the Midlands and other places where agriculture has not died away. And so there are dioramas of this landscape over the Harvard Experimental Forest, which give a very good idea of what things look like here. And it is by no means reminiscent of what we see today, when most of New England is again recovered with forest. My own state of New Hampshire is almost the exact opposite in terms of its proportion of forest to cleared land from what it was 175 or so years ago. We have about something in the neighborhood of 15 to 17% cleared land now, as opposed to 82 to 85% forested on a statewide basis. This is exactly the opposite of what it was in the heyday of the small-scale farming of the 18th and early part of the 19th centuries. Well, there are several things that make New England stone walls unique from a structural standpoint. First of all is the intention of those who built them. Unlike many other places in the world where dry stone construction is very common, the New England farmers who began our network of walls faced a particular set of circumstances. One of the very important ones was the type of stone that they encountered here, and the other one had to do with their own work in terms of preparing the landscape for farming. The fact that there was so much stone on the ground obligated them to move enormous amounts of it, whether it went into structures or not. And that meant that one of the primary goals of any stone wall building here was to use up as much stone as possible. Because of that, enormous numbers of New England stone walls are overbuilt in terms of their purpose, their original purpose. It doesn't look that way now in every area, but that was certainly one of the main goals of those who built the great network here. And that meant that walls were considerably wider and often thicker than they needed to be. Structures that were built for one purpose thus served two at the same time. And so the great wide ramps, for instance, that run to the second stories of barns, the causeways that fill enormous amounts of space, jumping over swampy areas or bridges made of dry laid stone that are far, far thicker than they need to be to hold themselves together. These all testify to the sheer amount of stone that had to be moved and stored somehow during this entire period of active wall building here. The second important thing to remember about New England stone walls is the quality of building stone here. Much of it is really lousy. There is a necessity to use up enormous amounts of stone that more fussy masons, more sophisticated traditions would find completely unacceptable. And that is also a part of how the styles of New England stone walls began to change over time. What most people find when they begin to try and build stone walls here is that the cooperative stone, the stone that makes it easier for builders, and I'm talking now about stone that has parallel top and bottom surfaces, stone that is squared off in some way, stone that is shattered so that it has many angles which fit together, is in New England somewhat present, but is also joined by many, many millions of tons of rounded glacial rubble that fits together about as well as a bunch of bowling balls. And so the techniques that they began to develop for the use of this stone in coherent structures tended to emphasize enough width and height to absorb large amounts of uncooperative stone. This resulted in the creation of a kind of practical formulas for the use of this stone in the structures that they built. And you can see these in practice in a lot of the older work. They're really, in spite of the enormous variety of ways that dry stone work can be made to look here in New England, there are really only two kinds of wall. One of them is the freestanding wall, a wall that rises into space on both sides and shows what we call faces, in other words, the outside surface on both of those sides. The other is, of course, the retaining wall, a type of wall that is built not to show faces on both sides, but to show a face on only one side and mark the difference between two different grades, grades of different height. The formula has to do with the mathematical relationship of width to height. Dry stone constructions will not hold themselves together at certain heights unless they have enough width to develop the mass they need in order to place enough weight on the lower parts of the wall in order to hold the structure together. So that all those things I talked about before that are conspiring to knock walls down at every moment will have less luck when they begin to work their malevolent magic. This formula for freestanding walls is about 3/4 to 1. What that means is that if you are proposing to build a 6-foot tall freestanding wall, then you have to begin with a footprint, in other words, a basic width, the part of the wall that actually touches the ground, of 4 feet, 3/4 of what the height, the projected height, is going to be. If it is thinner than that, it will not be able to withstand all the little things that are trying to knock it down nearly as well, and so will fall apart much sooner. It's worth recalling in this context Robert Frost's famous poem about fixing walls, his mending wall poem. That's the good fences make good neighbors poem. Lots and lots of things have been said about this poem. But one of the things that is not said as much as it ought to be is that what Frost and his neighbor are engaged in during the course of the poem is an annual chore. It is not a special event. It is something that had to happen every year. This is why towns had offices called fence viewers for many, many years. It was the job of these people to go around and look at everybody's walls and make recommendations or levy fines if those walls were not in the kind of shape that made them functional. If the fence viewers were alive today, all of the people in New England who own property would find themselves paying enormous fines almost every single year. This is probably why that office has been allowed to wither and die in so many towns. The relationship between width and height in retaining walls is much more extreme. It begins at 1:1 and goes up from there. I have worked for many, many years, although I work mostly alone now, in a family business, and I'm talking now about uncles and cousins and brothers wives, all a part of our stone wall crew for many years. We once restored a carriage house foundation near where we live that had in its cellar 8-foot tall stone walls to make up its foundation. Restoration can take two forms. One is simple repair, where you put back things that are fallen, but the other one is restoration, full restoration, which means that you've got to dismantle the entire structure because all the relationships within it, even if the wall is not fallen, have changed to enough of a degree to compromise its structural integrity, and therefore the entire thing has to be taken apart and put back together. That was the case in this with this particular foundation. When we dismantled it, remember that the walls are 8 foot tall in the cellar, we found more than 12 feet of carefully laid stone wall in its base all the way back into the hillside. That is 1 to 1.5. Now this particular foundation was built in the classically old-fashioned way. And by that I mean it was built as a kind of dam. You might think that if it was a freestanding wall, that the back side in the hill, the part you can't see, ran straight up as well. But it didn't. It tipped. It came up at an angle like a hypotenuse. So the footprint, which was 12 feet long, created this enormous mass of space behind the visible wall in the cellar of the building. And yet behind it, inside that space, there was a rough step up from thick to thin to about an 18-inch or so top, which is where the sills of the building rested. I'm inviting you to consider the amount of labor it must have taken to contemplate putting structures like this together into dugout situations, which would have required you to make an excavation 4 to 5 times the size of what the finished cellar was going to be in order to accommodate that stuff. This is a very common way that the foundations of New England buildings were put together for both barns and houses. You can sometimes see the results of this technique when you drive down the main streets of some of our nice old towns, like this one. Very often you'll see in some of the larger houses that line the main street, some of the older, more original colonial era houses, that the house itself is sitting on a kind of modest throne. In other words, the grade of the surrounding area has been raised in a rough shape that parallels the dimensions of the house sitting on the ground, and the house is thus a little bit raised up above. Sometimes this sort of throne is very, very obvious, and sometimes it's even blocked off with little retaining walls. You sometimes see the walkway that leads to the ceremonial front entrance that nobody uses. Has several series of steps, right? It's at street level when the walkway moves in, then it goes up 2 steps, and then it goes up another 3 steps, and then only then does it approach the front door. That raised grade and the shape that it takes is in part the fill that was taken out of the basement at the time of excavation for the cellar hole. In an era when there were no dump trucks, there were no Kubotas with giant scoops on them. Everything had to come out with shovels and picks and go into little dump carts. Sometimes they simply took a bunch of that fill and spread it out in a kind of shape, a little bit larger than the footprint of the house. And there was some practical value to this as well, because of course it would raise the wooden sills of the building a little bit further off the damp ground and make it possible for them to preserve themselves as well. There are many things that can be said about how to put a stone wall together so that it has some decent chance of lasting. Here in New England, we also face some conditional things that, for instance, make some of the things they can do in Great Britain a little bit dicey here. There is a technique for the filling the interiors of stone walls, for instance, in Great Britain, that is called hearting. Hearting. This consists of packing the middle of a stone wall with a kind of mixture of soil and gravel and small stones in order to fill it up without having to use a whole bunch of stone. Here in New England, of course, we want to use a whole bunch of stone, and so we don't tend to do that kind of hearting, but also it gets cold here. And so the interior of a stone wall cannot be filled with anything that is going to retain water, such as gravel or soil, or a bunch of stones that are too small. Those stones will tend to filter in between the larger ones over time and act as ball bearings. This is another condition of New England in which harsh winters and the constant possibility of freezing makes it impossible to do certain things that are done in other parts of the world with respect to the interiors of stone walls. What we have found in the old-timers' work is a mixture, not of small stones, but of small and large stones, put together in such a way that all of the stones in the wall occupy as much space as they possibly can, and no space at all is left that isn't absolutely necessary. When I first began to work and be taught by my uncle, who taught me how to do this, he set up a kind of informal apprenticeship. He didn't announce it or anything, he just allowed it to occur, in which I did not lay any stone at all that showed for a period of about 5 years, but rather instead learned how to pack interiors during that entire time. This, aside from being incredibly boring, was also very good training for the analysis of shapes and the habit of putting things together as tightly as it is possible to do. When there is no opportunity for interior movement in a stone wall, the things that conspire to tear it apart are much less effective. This is why some of the older agricultural type work, especially stone walls in between fields, which largely functions as dumps for all that material that was coming out of the fields on virtually on an annual basis and needed some place to go. This is why those walls have spread and collapsed so readily. Because many of them, even though they were built by the old-timers, whose work we largely revere, were put together in a much looser way than the way that we build them now. The trick was, generally speaking, to create two parallel lines of very large stones, and then simply begin to chuck everything that came out of the fields into that space, without bothering to place it or otherwise to put it in such a way that the amount of space in between individual stones within was minimized. This worked very well, except that over time, of course, this loosely thrown collection of stones in the interior began to settle. And it also began to overflow because the amount of stone that was coming out of the fields was almost inevitably more than the initial space that was laid out to receive it could take. And so the trick after that, as the stone walls began to overflow their little boundaries and leak out into the productive part of the field, was to set up two more lines of parallel stones, one on either side of this structure, and then create two new troughs in order to throw the waste stone that was coming out of the fields into. We have taken apart in between field walls in New Hampshire and in other places that ran to 15 to 20, even to 25 feet wide, and had within them 3 or even 4 separate sets of outside containment stones. It's one way to tell how long a farm was viable in the pre-Civil War years, because of course it would take several successive generations of farming success. In other words, the farm is still afloat in order to generate the amount of stone that you would have to have in order to create a structure that was that large. Well, as you can see, there's an enormous amount that can be said about this art. You're already grateful, I know, that I'm not going to say all of it, but I am going to tell you where you can get to most of it. And that is in my little collection of books. I'm going to begin with 2 general histories of New England wall building. This is Susan Allport's Sermons in Stone. It's about 25 years old now. It is still, in my opinion, the best general book about this subject that exists out there. It's easy to read, covers the territory, it brings it from the beginning right up to the present day. The present day, in this case, being about 1991. But believe me, the history of stone walls has not taken any substantial steps forward in the last 25 years, so I wouldn't worry about what happened after 1991. This is Robert Thorson's Stone by Stone. It's a newer book, maybe 15 years old now. It has the virtue of being written by a geologist, not a journalist. So it is, as you might imagine, extremely strong on the geological history of New England. It will tell you why we have all the stone that we have, and it recounts the incredibly violent geological history of this region, which features pretty much a little bit of everything. That's why the variety of types of stone here in this region is so enormous compared to many other parts of the world. There are approximately 7 million books about using stone in the garden. This is one of the better ones. It was written by Gordon Hayward, who knows a thing or two about New England because he lives across the river in Vermont, where he and his wife are garden designers. And this book is full of wonderful ideas, and their ideas will actually work here because they are from here. This is a book that is indispensable to anybody who simply loves old stone walls and appreciates them and likes to look at them. It is the only book that I know of that features work that ranges all across New England and shows in beautiful photographs, because it was written by a photographer, the range and extent of types and kinds and looks the stone walls can achieve here. The name of the photographer is Bill Hubble. He's from Maine, and he has virtually traveled all across New England and photographed almost everything that can be considered meaningful in terms of what dry stone construction can do and has done here. I'm going to show you this one photograph that I know you can't see, but I can't help but show it to you anyway. This photograph, I'll leave it open so that you can look at it. is a photograph of a tiny little piece of ruined farmland in upstate New York. It's an aerial photograph taken at a time of year when there were no leaves on the trees, and it shows very well the old medieval pattern of 1 and 2 and 3 acre fields, still perfectly preserved in this little acreage within the photograph, all across the stretch of land where it was taken. Just one look at this photograph and then use your imagination to extend this look across virtually all the arable land of the region, and you will be amazed that we only ended up with 250,000 miles instead of a great many more. It is that extensive. My last book is a book that isn't about New England and isn't even about America, but I had to bring it to show it to you because it is so strange and unique. It was written by a Swiss architect named Werner Glaser in 1977. It has become one of those mysterious little dinky paperbacks that is now selling for upwards of $500 on the net because apparently they didn't make enough copies. It is simultaneously printed in French, German, and English in case you want to brush up on your European language as well. It treats dry stonework in several sites in Europe, including the Aran Islands, where there is an astounding network of dry laid stone, and these villages in northern Italy at the base of the Alps, where entire buildings, walls and roof, are constructed of dry laid stone.
Wow.
How confident would you be going to sleep in an earthquake-prone region under a roof of loose boulders? And yet these buildings have stood for a very long time. My own book was written for 2 kinds of people. Those who would like to learn to build stone walls, and those who would not. I thought that would cover a lot of territory. It synthesizes most of the information, especially from Ms. Allport's book, and she was kind enough to write an introduction to mine as well, as a kind of payback for the plagiarism of fact that I visited upon her work. But it treats all this information from the standpoint of someone who is contemplating actually doing it. And so the goal of the book is to allow those who take a look at it to know what it is they are seeing as they travel across New England and to look at the fantastic remnants of our old stone wall network. And now I have come to the part that is most enjoyable to me, and that is where you tell me what it is you really want to know. Oh, I'm asking you for questions.
Yeah.
Yes, you may come and see the wall. And I refuse to believe that nobody has any questions. Yes, sir.
When a stone wall does start to deteriorate in a specific spot, and it is one of the lower stones that starts to leave out,
Right.
when you carry that, do you repair it like in a V?
Yes, that's exactly what you do. You want to
just keep bringing the stones back.
take it apart very carefully from the top down. And obviously you can't take down a straight line because the stones on each side are dependent on it. So it's almost like clearing the infected part away from a wound. And you usually end up with a kind of scoop down to the offender at the bottom, and then you can just rebuild it from the bottom.
Is that include the interior? You do that with the interior?
It often does, because of course when you deprive what is in the interior of the outside stones that are holding it in place, they're going to start leaking out too. So what you do is very carefully, stone by stone, don't go digging in there like a dog, just flinging everything everywhere. You want to take it apart very carefully because you want to disturb the least amount of the wall possible. If you're not setting out to completely dismantle it and restore it, you just want to repair that fallen spot. The way that you take it apart, it needs to be very careful. So that you don't disturb stones that don't need to be disturbed, even though you're temporarily depriving them of their side-to-side support in some cases. Usually, and it almost always involves taking out more than you wanted to or expected to, especially in a well-built wall where the dependencies of individual stones are going to multiply across the entire face of the wall. It may take you taking a few courses apart on either side before you get to a place where there's a stable end to your destruction. Yes?
Is there a way to determine how old the walls are?
Boy, there really isn't. Techniques don't change much over time. There are some things that you can take as clues. One of them is how carefully selected the individual stones are in a wall. The way that styles developed in wall building moves from rough to smooth and more careful. And this self-consciousness about how walls look begins way back around the same time as the Greek Revival in about 1830 or so, in which the agricultural walls were largely complete, but walls were beginning to take on a kind of symbolism. I mean, the wonderful curmudgeonly dictionary maker Noel Webster once observed that sloppy or ill-built walls on a farm were a sign of laziness or sloth on the part of the farmer, or both. And so, if you see a wall that is very carefully put together with clearly selected stones, and by selected I mean the stones will appear to be all within a narrow range of shapes and sizes. Carefully selected for instance, square corners, or other parallel top and bottom surfaces, or other features that you see repeated all across the wall. You know when you see a wall like that, it's really carefully put together. And the stones look as though they were picked to fit in every spot that you look at. That there was a large amount of uncooperative stone that didn't make it into the wall, whereas in an older agricultural style wall, you'll see crazy fits and wild shapes because the builder was trying to use up everything that came to hand. That's the major difference between walls of the older agricultural type and the walls that begin to develop in about the third of the way through the 19th century, and of course right up through the end of the century as well. Some of these walls also reflect the changes in who was building them. There was a great influx of immigration into this country in the middle of the 19th century, and many of the people who came here, especially from places with long traditions of dry stone building, such as Ireland, Greece, Italy especially, became quite well known for wall building here and still are. However, their style of wall building was far more decorative and far more carefully laid as far as what shows on the surface of the wall, of the face. And it's quite different from the older rough and ready agricultural style of the early American builders. So that's one way to tell some things about age. There is, in about 1830 as well, we see the invention of these marvelous little things. These are feathers and wedges. And they are a way of splitting stone that turned out to be far more accurate than what had been passing for stone cutting before that. And this system produces those little half-shaped finger holes on the upper edges of large blocks of granite. No piece of granite could be cut that way before about 1830. And so if you see that type of stone in a wall or in a foundation, you can be reasonably sure that that structure does not date earlier than that. But these are only general clues. Since the essential techniques of dry stone building and the stone itself has not changed from era to era, it's very difficult to simply look at a wall and say something about its date. You need provenance of some outside kind if you want to be sure. Yes, sir?
Do the walls taper from bottom to top?
This is a thing that came over from Great Britain. It's called battering, and what it means is that the footprint of the wall on the ground is wider, thicker than, and it tapers in, so that the front faces of the walls slide in. It is something that we do see in some New England walls. One of the adaptations of that style was a kind of adaptation that puts a straight-up vertical wall out at the roadside or on the public side and batters it up on the back side, the private side. You see this a lot in some of the old cemetery walls. I wonder why that. It is also held by some builders that this creates a more stable structure, although that I think is subject to some disagreement. If you build correctly, it seems to me that you might as well build straight up. But the reason I think that we don't see as much of it in New England as we might, although it's quite common in Great Britain and in other places, is that it uses less stone. If you're tapering up, you're not going to use as much. And with the ancillary objective, in so many cases, being to use up as much stone as possible, the straight up style seems to be more predominant here. Yes?
Did they simply lay them on the ground with the initial stones?
In most cases, yes.
So they didn't dig trenches at all?
Well, there are circumstances in which one needs to dig a trench. When the ground is very soft, where it's obvious it's going to compress a great deal. If the wall is going to be mortared and thus be rigid instead of have the relative flexibility that a dry stone wall has, because of, for instance, if you heave up a little bit of a dry stone wall and it lets go, it tends to sag back into the positions it has had before, up to a point. What we do when we go to a place where no wall has stood before and we're going to build something is we try to dig a hole in the ground with a spade. If it's soft enough and pliable enough to drive a spade without needing to use a pick or a bar, we will dig a trench 18 to 24 inches deep and fill it with crushed riprap at 1.5 inch, the 1.5 inch size, small, that you can rake flat, and it creates a relatively flexible but also very firm base that will not sink faster on one part of the wall than it does on another. However, if we try to drive our spade, we hit 3 rocks, and we try to drive it again, and we hit 18 rocks, and we know that we're looking at some of that famous glacial till, which has all the give of cement. We do what the old-timers largely did, and that is build directly on the ground. This can be deceiving, because in places, for instance, where reforestation has long ago come and taken over yet again, walls disappear both from the top down and the bottom up. In a place that's been reforested for 175 years, you can gain as much as a foot or 2 of new soil up against the old walls. And if you excavate one of those, you may be deceived by thinking that there was a trench there that was filled with stone in order to bear the wall, when the fact is that when, in the open landscape of the time that the wall was built, it was laid directly on the ground, and then when the forest came back, it began to, because these walls act like snow fences, they catch everything that blows through the woods, the branches, the trees, all this junk that falls off, falls to the ground in the forest. So the wall is disappearing from bottom up too, and this is one of the reasons why many of our old walls, which once stood 4 to 5 feet tall, are now 2 or 3 feet tall. There's another foot or more of original wall down below the new grade of soil that's up against it. But the old-timers' practice, whenever it was possible, was to build directly on the ground. Yes?
Approximate cost today of walls, like per 100 feet, with rock there and without rock there. What is it running?
Without rock there, it's a third more anyway. I just estimated a project which is going to be about 160 feet of old-style double-faced wall in a place where they don't have any stone. And it's going to be about 2.5 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The full estimate of this structure was $43,000, but the cost of getting stone to the site was almost $20,000. This wall is going to be built of old, weathered fieldstone too. Here's where our old farmer forebears could be induced to have heart attacks. Because this stuff that they killed themselves getting off the surface of the ground and digging out most of their lives is now worth upwards of $600 to $800 a ton when it is palletized and sold at stone yards. Now, our predominant type of stone is granite. It weighs 165 pounds a cubic foot. How much is a ton on a volume basis? Not much. Hardly the size of one of these tables, if you think of this table as a solid rectangle all the way to the floor. That's in the neighborhood of a ton. It's just not very much. And this is why, of course, the old weathered fieldstone is now a target of thieves, because it is so tremendously valuable as building material.
Because my husband read in the paper that from the Salt and Pepper Bridge, there were pieces of granite that would be available for sale for mailboxes.
The post, yeah.
And not only would you have to pay a considerable amount of money for the granite, but you'd have to have arrangements to have.
You'd have to transport it.
Yeah, you couldn't just throw it in your pickup truck and
Oh, come.
drive on.
That's right.
So
Well, this is
it amazes me how they used to build with granite. That's why they floated it apparently off
Sure.
the shore.
it's always easier to move things by water, especially heavy things. Yeah.
So
Yes.
Are there very many early, say, colonial period, revolutionary period, walls that are known dates?
No,
Is that
there aren't
just
very
very
many.
possible?
Without information in a diary or official town information, for instance, about when a wall was put together, it's virtually impossible to know. Sometimes there are family histories or town histories that indicate when a certain thing was built, but these things are rare. Stone wall building, there was nothing special about it during the major era when most of these walls were built. It was an ordinary chore, like mucking out the barn. Everybody knew something about doing it. Maybe 10% of the people who were engaged in it were very good at it, and another 10% were completely hopeless, and the middle 80% knew the basics of the task but wouldn't be called masters, and they're the ones who are responsible for most of the network. So knowing who did what when is virtually impossible in most places, unless you have some sort of outside evidence. Yeah.
how did they move the larger, heavier stones into place?
This question has a two-part answer. First, they were exceptionally skillful with the application of basic mechanical leverage. Two guys with 6-foot iron bars who know what they're doing can virtually make a 1-ton stone get up and dance. It doesn't take that long before you know exactly where to apply what you do. In addition to that, of course, they used animal power. They moved heavy material on stone boats, which are basically 3 planks with a prow that are pulled along the ground. They moved a lot of heavy weights in the wintertime when the tracks all freeze, and it's much easier. They had a number of little basic tricks that you would figure out yourself if you were confronted with having to move enormous weights by non-motorized means. One of them was their willingness to build temporary ramps almost anywhere. And it's very important when you look at an old New England structure, whether it's a stone wall out in the open or a foundation or any other, or a bridge or something like that, to remember that those great big stones at the size of small cars that are 6 or 8 feet off the ground almost certainly never left the ground when they went to those spots. In the case of foundations, for instance, if you see a huge stone 4 or 5 feet off the ground in a foundation wall, you can be virtually certain that it was not lifted into place from the basement floor, but rather dragged down the back side of the excavation or rolled down that side to be put in place. One very obvious trick is to leave one end of the wall at ground level so that it itself becomes a kind of ramp up which a stone can be rolled. And this is where the artistry of the iron bar comes in, because you can make a stone roll continuously if you have 2 or more guys with iron bars. One takes a slice at it or pries it up, and then the next one jumps into the crack that's been created and rolls it a little further while the first one readjusts, and so on and so forth. You can make a stone roll continuously. Another fun trick was to create a temporary ramp for very large stones, create a temporary ramp on one side of the project, if it happens to be a wall, put the team on the other, attach to the stone you are proposing to move, you attach what is known as a rolling hitch to it. A rolling hitch is a way of attaching a rope or a chain to a large object so that when it is pulled by the team or whatever your power source is, it doesn't drag, it flips over. This is very easy to do. All you have to do is put the knot that ties the rope around the stone on the back side, on the upper corner of the back side, and then it will pull it up and over rather than drag it along the ground. They sometimes invented contraptions that looked like painter scaffolds that would straddle the project and have a pulley system or a chain fall in the middle so that you could, in this case, bring the stone off the ground and then just move it down the line. In places where the stonework is very large and of industrial type size, like jetties at the ocean side or along the rivers, or mill races where very large blocks are being used to create chutes for the water to come through. They often erected several contraptions known as gin poles. A gin pole is 2 logs, about the size of telephone poles. One of them is planted directly in the ground. The other one is attached to it at an angle with an iron collar and a chain across the 2 tops to hold it together. In this case also, the pulley system or the chain falls at the end of this improvised crane brings the stone off the ground, but only a few inches or maybe a foot. And then it can be swung around just like a crane and dropped back into place. The great beauty of a gin pole system is that it can be plucked up and moved almost anywhere. You can see old 19th century paintings of shipyards and other industrial places where the entire landscape is a virtual forest of these gin pole systems. When the big cranes came in, now you see a bunch of cranes at a shipyard sticking up in the air. It used to be these improvised gin poles. So that's the first part of the answer. Wonderful mastery of the mechanical means available to them. The second part of the answer has something to do with attitude. We're talking about people here who are certainly not afraid of work. These are people who would pick up their church and take it 500 feet down the road because the Methodists next door were singing too loud on Sunday mornings. These people aren't kidding around. They know how to move a heavy object. And the secret of moving a heavy object, aside from the mechanical means, is to be patient about it. When I first began to work with my uncle, he was very fond of telling me, if you can move it an inch, you can move it a mile. And he's right. You just have to be willing to move it a mile, an inch at a time. I told this story in a little town in New Hampshire about 4 months ago, and a guy in the audience put up his hand and said, "We did that," talking about moving churches. "We brought ours down from the top of the hill over there. See, there it is, across the road." It was a 40 by 60 timber frame building. They had dragged down a hill a mile away. I said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "It was too cold up there." It was too cold. So he picked it up and brought it down. By the way, he said this event had occurred in 1838. He had a proprietary feeling for the events of his town, as so many of us do. They included him even though he was not on the scene. And to me, there's something essential about New England in that. Yes?
Have you done any study on Old Town pounds?
Oh yes, I've restored them, and yeah.
Is any of that in your book, or do you have written information about it?
Not historical information about pounds in general, although there is a drawing of the pound in Londonderry, New Hampshire that my family and I restored some years ago. One of the great things about pounds is that the old pounds is that many of them are built like house foundations, except they're just completely exposed. They have the same battered outside wall, but vertical walls on the inside so that nothing can climb out of it once it's put in there. They were in general, although certainly not in every case, about 30 by 30 structures, and they featured walls that had to run to at least 6 feet tall, and in many cases quite a bit taller than that. Of course, a lot of them are deteriorated and don't have that much bulk in them anymore. Many were augmented with wooden poles or hewed timbers on the top as well that extended their height without the necessity for more stonework. But they're wonderful structures, and there are thousands of them still around. They're great. Yeah. Yes?
My Italian grandfather came over at age 15 and built walls. Lots of estates on the North Shore, and my dad's favorite thing was to stick me in the car and drive me all over the North Shore and
show you his walls.
Pa's walls.
That's so great.
But a lot of them were also like for the aesthetics of the landscape, because I mean they were very wealthy people that
yes.
So it wasn't always just function, I mean, my grandfather also gardened, was a gardener, but also, a lot of it also was the aesthetics of the landscape, correct, on these
No
big
question
estates?
about it. In fact, it's a major story about New England's walls. That shift from
Functional to-
practical,
right.
functional roughness
To
to
the aesthetics.
decorative, careful aesthetics begins to occur in the middle part of the 19th century as we see, for instance, rich industrialists from the city moving up into places like Jaffrey and Wolfboro in New Hampshire, Mitt Romney's stomping grounds. That's a summer resort that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And what you did when you joined that escaping herd of city folks was you bought some old wrecked farm and you turned it into a nice place that was suitable for you, and very often you did something about improving the stonework there. And you would hire yourself a crew of Irish or Italian immigrants who knew what they were doing, and they would come and build something for you. There's an awful lot of that kind of work throughout northern New England and in Massachusetts as well. And it has now, although it's quite different from what the old farmers built, it has blended into the landscape in ways that make it part of the whole scene now. Castle in the Clouds up in Ossipee, New Hampshire is one such place. And the quality of the stonework up there is miles away from what the old farmer type stonework is, but it still has a kind of beauty to it, and certainly it has historical value as well. You could see the remnants of, some of this decorative work has now deteriorated right along with the old farmer work as well. So you sometimes see the old pillars that they put at the bottoms of their driveways kind of tipping over, and they're all worn out. This genteel wreckage of old New England, you might say, is part of the charm of the place in many ways. And we have found as contemporary builders that it has an enormous effect on what people ask for now. For instance, one of the questions that some of our clients have asked us, and this has happened many more times than once, is that when we start to do the work for them, they go, "Don't make it look too nice." I said, "Is this a question you would ask the guy who comes to redo your kitchen?" Don't make it look too nice. I restored 500 feet of old single stack wall for a wonderful client a couple of years ago, and he wanted it restored, so I brought it back up to about 4 feet high. He called me a month and a half later and said, "Please come take 1.5 feet off the top of this wall. I can't stand looking at it. It doesn't look right." So we're really, we really have become used to this kind of level of distress. It's almost like the way people like old chipped paint on an ancient chair or something like that. Here in this familiar landscape of ours.
What is a pound?
I'm sorry. A town pound is an enclosure built to receive stray animals in the 19th and 18th centuries. There were laws about stray animals in a place where everyone was a farmer, and if Brown's cows down the road got out and got into your corn, you could suffer some serious real losses. And so there were laws about stray animals, and if one got out and it was captured by somebody, this was where it was taken. And it was put into that enclosure, and you had to pay a fine to get it back. And each pound would have a keeper, somebody who was responsible for maintaining it and for collecting the fines for the town for animals that went wandering and ended up in town. It was animal jail.
I must have known what it was, because all I could think of was dogs and cats.
Well, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing as the dog pound, except this was also the sheep and the pig and the horse and the cow pound. Yes?
Might be a little different, but how about a stone-lined well? What are they?
Stone-lined wells are fancy. They're wonderful. And they are, by the way, possibly the most enduring structures because they are round. Stone-lined wells are retaining walls. They're just tubular ones. But what's great about them is that in a stone-lined well, you're talking about concentric circles that get bigger as they go out, right? And what that means is that when you look down a stone-lined well, you are not looking at the fat ends of the stones that comprise it. You are looking at the points. That means, and because it is a complete circle made of these points, The fat butts of these stones are embedded in a circular, unending mass from which they cannot escape. That is why stone-lined wells last so beautifully and so rarely fall in. How they're built, you got to dig a great big hole. Not straight down. That's how to die.
One theory was to start the top.
The hole is a giant cone. It's really wide up top, and it gets narrower and narrower as it goes down. So it's a massive hole. Now, you fill it in as you start to build the wall, because obviously you cannot build a stone wall from the top down. You have to start at the bottom, and you have to do that in a well.
But you're in water.
Well, you've got to bail it and build fast. I know this because I have built a stone wall. Usually, in a place where you're digging a well, unless you hit an active spring, the water does not come shooting in right away. It trickles in over time. And so you can work for several hours, and maybe then you have to take some bucketfuls out, and maybe when you come back the next morning, there's a foot of water in the hole, and you can take that out. But of course, as you get up, as soon as you're 2 or 3 feet off the ground, the water does not catch up with you as you continue to build. It builds up over time. Some of these wells are quite spectacular. I saw one down in Dublin, New Hampshire one time. It was 12 feet across. It was that enormous. And it was up on a hill, too, so that the gravity feed the water to the farm below. Absolutely ingenious. Still full of water. It's completely clear. They're wonderful structures. They took a little time to build, but so did everything else. Yes.
You mentioned that there were a lot of stone pounds still around New England. Are you aware of any books on that?
There was I saw a little pamphlet about that. It was one of those things that some local historical society had put together that covered a bunch of them in Maine and some in New Hampshire as well. I'm not aware of any book that focuses on the old pounds or makes an effort to collect them or to ascertain exactly who still has one and who doesn't. But I know there are dozens of them in New Hampshire because I run across them all the time in various states of disrepair or restoration. There is a recent book, too. I heard you talking about powder houses, many of which are built out of stone. There is a new book about powder houses by somebody right down here in this area. He lives in New Hampshire, actually, but right over the border in Kingston or someplace like that. It's very interesting about powder houses. They were storage places for ammunition and for guns and the town's collection of armaments, and they were very important, especially in the period between the Revolution and the War of 1812, when most of them were built. Yes?
A lot of the houses have, like you mentioned earlier, a big stone in the foundation of the houses.
Yes.
Are you saying that in the foundation then, if it's about 6 feet high of these big stones, how far back does it go?
Well, if it was built along the general lines of one I described to you, it would go back 8 to 10 to more feet back into the bank. But then, of course, it would step up and become thinner and thinner as it rose. So it's really only the bottom 2 or 3 feet that's that wide as far as height.
Because the stone in the basement is straight,
That's right, sure. But if you
around.
backfill as you go, then you always have a ramp of earth coming down to whatever the top of the wall happens to be.
There's not a tendency to
the
start
structure.
pushing it in?
Not if you
Not really.
are careful.
No.
One of the things you learn after you do it for a while is your sense of verticality gets sharpened up a little bit. It's not very hard to build something that looks quite vertical. But you're right about the danger of of tending to step in a little bit with each succeeding layer of stone, because your instinct to make it stable and not to be poking out begins to become part of how you evaluate where you're going to place any given stone. But all it takes is to step down the line and look along the plane of the developing wall to know if it's too far out or not. And if you don't trust your own eyes that way, you can set strings up at any given height along the line of what you're building, and make sure that those are successively vertical as you go to give yourself a guide. What we have found, especially in restoring older work, is that it's better if it wanders a tiny bit, a little bit, because it looks more authentic that way. It is possible to build stonework that is too nice, apropos of what I was saying before, that does not have a kind of look of I don't know, the wisdom of experience, something like that. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say I grew up in Rockport, Mass. And because there's a book written by Barbara Urkel, Hammers on Stone, if anybody's interested. And my grandparents worked in the quarries, dug out the stone, and built the houses, and I lived in one of those houses.
Yeah.
With matching stone on either side, and with the big derrick that they used to haul it.
Yeah.
And the derrick was still there when I was there for a little while.
Fascinating.
It was just fascinating. And they built beautiful walls.
Yeah, oh, of course they do. Yeah, that's the quarrying on the coast here, especially in Rockport. Is very famous. Wonderful. Yes?
I just wanted to tell the gentleman up front that there's a town pound right in Essex off Route 133.
Right there,
There's
yeah.
a big historical sign there. It says Essex Town Pound.
Great.
If he wants to go look at it.
Oh, I bet there's 25 of them within, I don't know,
I mean,
that
it's
many
just 10
miles
minutes
of
from here. He could go and see
Sure.
all the walls. They're probably deteriorated, and there's some houses
Yeah.
in there, but it's a historical site.
Some of them are still in pretty decent shape.
Yeah. Yeah, right off Route 133 before you get into the causeway.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, they're often near the old town centers, you know, within, not very far.
Past Hardy's Egg Farm. You know what that was.
Okay, great. Yes?
I have a dry cistern in my property because it's not on top of my property. Was that used for gray water? Or it's a dry, huge, probably.
Is it inside the house?
Well,
Is it in the
I
basement?
can't give all my secrets away. This one's out in the yard.
But it's in the ground.
Yeah.
Usually they were for drinking water. I haven't heard of commonly built stone cisterns that were used for wastewater. I think it's probably accurate to say that our forebears were somewhat less fastidious about wastewater than we are.
So you actually think it held water? I'd have to.
Oh, I'm sure it did.
And Suzanne,
It's
do
very
you have a well
strong.
too?
Sure.
Yeah.
So at my house, there's a well, and there was piping under the ground
Yeah.
into a huge stone cistern, which then went into the house.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They could be sealed up with pitch or other tar, that sort of thing. Yes.
We live in an early 1700s house that's right on the road, surrounded by stone walls, wonderful old stone walls, with a huge, is it called an erratic rock?
Uh-huh.
A big giant, they called it the Great Rock,
Yeah.
and then the stone walls all go around it. I worry so much because we have these tractor trailers that, I mean, nonstop to the, that, has anybody done studies on what these tractor trailers are doing to the, I know you said that little by little, but.
I don't know about studies, but
studies
but
on
there
it?
is vibration, obviously, if the
Well, I
walls
know
are
in my
very near the
house
road.
what it does, I'm
Yeah.
always, adjusting mirrors, sconces.
I don't think are you worried that this stone is going to roll
Not the
down and
erratic
crush you?
so much, but I'm just worrying about all the regular stone walls.
Well, they're probably sustaining a little bit of shaky, as time goes by. But if they haven't changed very much in the time that you've been observing them, it's probably very slow. But there's no question that would be part of their slow sag, or probably not a catastrophic part, but a part nonetheless. In a lot of these towns, the walls are right on the road. They come right up within a couple of feet of all the traffic, so they do sustain some.
But there's no studies, nobody's out there doing this.
Not that I know of. That doesn't mean that. Have you had enough? We're getting kicked out of here.